Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. So this episode wanted to really focus on how to evaluate competitive environments by assessing their opportunities and really looking at how do companies build and sustain competitive advantage. And for this, I've brought in an expert in this space, Dr. Michael Roberto, who is the Trustee Professor of Management at Bryant University in Rhode Island. He joined the tenure faculty there after serving 6 years on the faculty of Harvard Business School. His research focuses on decision making, teamwork, and leadership, and he has published 3 books, the latest of which is titled Unlocking Creativity. So, welcome to the program, Mike. So happy that you're joining us again.
Thanks, Charles. Great to be with you today.
So, today's topic, I've had you on the program a few times. We talked about design thinking, about critical thinking. You had some great stories, some great examples. Today, I really want to explore that area of strategy and really how do companies build and sustain competitive advantage by choosing the right strategy. So, I'd love for you to kind of give a little bit of background of what you believe the main purpose of strategy is and really talking about it in the context of building that and hopefully sustaining competitive advantage.
Yeah, for me, strategy is about choosing what you want to do and what you don't want to do, right? So as to set yourself apart from the competition, right? The goal is to create a distinctive position in the marketplace that sets you apart from your rivals, and then to build a moat around your castle, meaning to somehow defend your position that you've created and be able to sustain that. Of course, that's very difficult. A lot of people will build something that might look distinctive in the short term, but that can be easily imitated. And if it can be easily imitated, then you're not going to have enduring success. And so the question is, how do you build something that's difficult to imitate so that you can have that long-lasting, strong performance?
And so, with the fundamental question being, why do some firms perform better than others? You have really it in 2 parts. First is look at industry attractiveness, and then we'll dive deeper into that competitive advantage space on how do you establish it and how do you sustain it. But first, industry attractiveness, and there's one model that's been used a lot in the past. It's not a perfect model, but it does provide a framework by which you can analyze industry attractiveness, and that's Porter's 5 forces framework.
Performance, as Porter taught us so many years ago, is driven by 2 factors, right? It is driven in part by what industry you're in. And then, of course, the remainder of your performance is driven by how well within that industry you perform relative to your competitors. But industries do differ dramatically in their profitability. That is something Porter observed decades ago and that we know is still true today. And so we do need to understand our competitive landscape, right? What are the challenges that we face in that landscape? Put another way, I think you build the strategy from the outside in, right? You have to understand your environment, right? Rather than being insular and thinking only, well, what are we good at? Well, yes, what are we good at matters, but we have to first understand who are the competitors, who are the customers, what's our landscape, right? If we're going to be able to build our strategy. And so Porter introduced for us a framework for doing that, the so-called 5 forces, which is, as you say, not a perfect tool, but a very simple and easy to understand and use technique for getting a very quick understanding of the main pressure points in our industry that will affect our profitability.
Now, using this framework, the first step is really define that industry, then identify the players, the buyers, the suppliers, the rivals, assess the strength of each force. And I thought just to illustrate this model, it'd be nice to analyze it with a certain industry. And let's pick the airline industry. And we'll go through each one of the 5 forces. I'll kind of give just a brief summary of that force. And you can kind of, if that's okay, just identify, okay, in this industry, here's how this force really shows itself. Does that work, Mike?
It works. And airlines, Charles, is a great choice. The famous joke by Richard Branson, he said, everybody asks me all the time, how do you become a millionaire, Richard? And he says, oh, it's very easy. You start with $1 billion and then you open an airline, right? It is one of the least profitable industries on earth. And it's been consistently unprofitable for a century, essentially, since the Wright brothers first put a plane in the sky. And it's not because there's a bunch of bad managers in the airline industry. That's sort of the popular press interpretation. But the enduring low performance of the industry is because of some structural forces and not simply because of, quote, bad management. which is, I think, where Porter's framework is really helpful. By the way, that is not to say that no one can make any money in the airline industry, because you and I know some examples of firms that have performed well. But overall, it's what we might consider a pretty unattractive industry environment.
You're absolutely right. And let's examine each one of those forces, and let's pick the one airline that really has bucked this trend that's been the anomaly, and that's Southwest. So the first force in the Porter's Five Forces model is barriers to entry. Are there serious, heavy, large barriers to entry for new competitors coming in, or can they enter the market pretty easily? So what would you say in the airline industry? Barriers to entry are low or high?
Yeah. So initially, right, people often their gut reaction is there must be high barriers to entry. I mean, it must be expensive to open an airline. Well, of course, it's more expensive than opening a pizza restaurant, right? But actually, if you just go and Google, like every year, new airlines that open this year, what you find is there's always new airlines being started. So that must mean, right? Wait, the barriers must not be as significant as we think. So when we think about barriers to entry, we think about capital requirements. And one of the things that lessens the capital requirement in airlines is you can lease planes. You don't have to buy planes. And oh, by the way, you can lease gently used planes. And here's the oddity, because companies are going bankrupt all the time in this industry, there are planes available, right? If you want to buy planes, well, a lot of times people will be opportunistic, right? And buy planes during industry downturns, and they get good deals as a result, or they lease them during downturns. You need airport slots. And yes, there are congested airports where it's hard to get access, but there are these regional airports that are often looking to drive economic development, bring tourists to their area and stuff. And so often startup airlines will go there. You need talented employees, but the US Air Force is training pilots for you and doesn't cost you, right? So there's ability to go out and recruit military pilots. So once you start to peel that onion a little bit, you realize, oh, maybe the barriers are not as significant as we think, right? We don't need to go to LaGuardia with a brand new plane that we purchased with pilots that we trained from the ground up. Actually, we can go get a military pilot who already knows how to fly a plane, train them to fly commercial, go to a regional airport with a leased plane, and we're in business. So the barriers are more formidable than a pizza restaurant, but not nearly as formidable as, say, opening a pharmaceutical company.
That's great information. And that's really what Southwest has taken advantage of with getting into this space and getting into this space without having to buy a significant number of planes. They lease all of their planes. They lease one type of Boeing plane. And you're right, the military trains a lot of its pilots, and they're not operating through a hub and spoke model. They're operating out of regional, smaller airports where it's cheaper to lease space. So that's one part where really Southwest has differentiated itself. So barriers to entry are low. Bargaining power of customers, that's another force in the five force model. And for the airline industry, that's high, correct?
Super high, right? Consumers have all the power. Why do we have all the power? The product is relatively undifferentiated, right? Meaning, I like to joke, the service is terrible on all the airlines, right? I mean, maybe a few exceptions, but it's a relatively undifferentiated service. An airline seat is an airline seat is an airline seat. Not a lot that distinguishes it. But also, very importantly, there's this layer between the airlines and the customer, which are these aggregators, Expedia, Travelocity, et cetera. And, basically, they're terrible for the airlines because what they're doing is giving enormous power to us as consumers to find the lowest price flight at any given point in time, right? So their ability to make prices fully transparent and easily shoppable and comparable is not good news for the airlines. It's great news for us as the consumer. It's really empowering. And the other thing is we're not very loyal. So even though frequent flyer mileage programs are quite extensive, at the end of the day, they don't breed as much loyalty as you would think. They might for the business traveler who's on an expense account, but for the consumer, the tourist, if I'm taking my family of 5 on a trip, well, I am a frequent flyer on one particular airline. But if I can save $200 a person by going on a different airline, well, that's $1,000 I save. The mileage is never going to be worth that much, right? So I'm going to take the cheapest ticket. And so loyalty is pretty low. Differentiation is low. Lots of aggregators that help us shop for price. We have a lot. We're in the driver's seat. Sorry, bad pun, but we are.
And with Southwest, they've taken that low cost strategy. So that makes complete sense when buyer power is so
And they
high.
don't
Now,
sell through the aggregators, right? You have to
that's
go to
right.
their website, right? They don't use the aggregators. Yeah.
Yep. Next one is bargaining power suppliers. And in this case, with the airline industry, it's very high.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the three main suppliers. Well, you need planes. And if you talk about jumbo jets, there's only two suppliers in the world, Boeing and Airbus. Regional jets, you can add one or two more, but very limited supply. Engines are made by three companies, so that's not good. The workforce is highly unionized. That's a bargaining power issue. And then, of course, fuel. We have, OPEC and, major cartel, international cartel that's driving the price of oil in many cases. So it's a difficult supplier environment.
The next one is threat of substitutes, and that's high because there's lots of other forms of transportation.
Well, there are, but it's even worse than that, right? So yes, there's buses and trains and cars, but of course, even more importantly, and the pandemic really illustrated this, is here we are, Charles, on Zoom or on some other, it's not Zoom, but on a comparable platform, having this conversation. I didn't need to fly out to the West Coast, or you didn't need to fly out to the East Coast to do this, right? So technology is perhaps the biggest substitute. It's allowing us to conduct business in lots of ways without actually having to get on a plane. And that's a real issue. Actually, Herb Kelleher, the co-founder of Southwest, really understood this. He used to say, in fact, he said this to 60 Minutes once. He said, shareholders would complain to him back in the early days when he was only flying within Texas. They'd say, Herb, you've got a one-way ticket from Dallas to Houston for $19. Your nearest competitor is selling that ticket for $65. Can't you raise your price a little bit and make some more money for your shareholders? So you don't understand at all. He goes, $19 is slightly less than what it costs to drive a car from Dallas to Houston. Our competitor is not other airlines. Our competitor is the car. We're trying to beat the substitute, right? And he understood that. A lot of other airlines think if you're only thinking about the other competitors, you're forgetting that there are these substitutes. And before it was other more forms of transportation back then, but now technology is an issue. And we aren't having to get on planes for business. Of course, tourists are a little different. We still like to go sit on the beach in Aruba, right? We can't do that virtually, or we can. It's not nearly as much fun. But business is different.
But you're right, that technology piece, that's another factor to consider when you're looking at substitutes and broadening that focus of what a substitute could be. The fifth force is really, I think, the most unique with the airline industry, and that's the rivalry among existing competitors, extremely high. Like you said, they're competing on price, but it's really a homogeneous product with high fixed costs and low marginal or variable costs, correct?
Yeah, Charles, you hit it right on the head. I mean, it's a homogenous product, meaning there's not a lot of product differentiation, and that's always going to create some price competition. But what really aggravates it in the case of the airlines is this ratio of fixed to variable cost. So if you think about, Charles, we're going to put you on a plane tomorrow from LA to Dallas, okay? And so putting that plane in the sky and putting you on that plane, almost all the costs are fixed, right? The incremental expense of putting you on that plane in seat 21B is, ready for a bad dad joke? It's literally peanuts, right? I mean, because they give you some peanuts. What else do they give you, right? There's just not a lot of incremental expense. Now, what does that mean? What that means is any price above zero is generating what we call contribution margin, meaning it's generating revenue that can help cover fixed costs. So there's this race to the bottom in the airline industry with regard to price, because any price you give them, obviously there's some variable cost, but not much is generating contribution. So this is really difficult. And the other piece to it is it's a perishable product, meaning once the plane takes off, you can never sell seat 21B on that flight on that day ever again, right? So it's not something you can store in inventory and sell later. So there's this just immense pressure to fill every seat. It's why they overbook the planes, right? There was a Wall Street Journal analysis a few years ago that showed that, on many domestic flights, until they sell those last few seats, they literally don't turn a profit. That's how thin the margins are, right? And so that's tremendous pressure. It creates incredible price wars in the airline industry.
So that's a great analysis and an overview of those Porter's five forces that can be applied to many different industries. Once again, there are shortcomings with it. And like you mentioned, Mike, there's also, it's a very simplified model, but it provides a nice framework, a structure to analyze an industry for its attractiveness, understanding the environment that you have to compete in, which is one of those two fundamental questions that really you need to answer if you want to develop a strategy that's going to differentiate your brand and sustain a competitive advantage.
Yeah. And, just flip it on its head and think about why pharmaceuticals is so profitable. Big barriers to entry, Consumers have a lot less power. The doctor makes the choice for us in many cases. What's the substitute to taking your heart medication? I mean, death, surgery, or marijuana. It's not very good. Well, maybe the last one for some, but it's not, you really flip it on its head, right? And think about the structural forces for an industry like that. And you realize pretty quickly, okay, so this isn't about just simply about good management and bad management. There's some really underlying economic drivers that really are in sharp contrast in those industries.
And what really fascinates me too is that when you get into this industry analysis and you see some industries that are not attractive at all, but you identify certain players that really have differentiated themselves, that really draws my attention, and I'm sure many others, to say, what are they doing so differently? How can they compete so effectively in such a competitive market when industry attractiveness is not great, like Southwest in the airline industry? And we'll talk about here in a little bit Trader Joe's and the supermarket industry. So the industry attractiveness is the first thing, but then you want to say, okay, how do you establish that advantage? So you're in this industry. How do you establish a competitive advantage? And there's really, to simplify it once again, there's different types of competitive advantage. And we'll just talk about three: the low cost player, the differentiator, and the dual advantage one, which is kind of that blue ocean strategy that's hard to sustain. But let's first talk about the low cost player. And Mike, maybe you can give us some insight into, what are they really going after and some of the key characteristics?
Yeah. I mean, a low cost player, their goal is to take the full range of costs. When we talk about costs, we don't just mean what it takes to build the iPhone, right? We talk about all the full. A low cost player is saying we're going to try to drive those costs down dramatically. We're going to sacrifice on price, meaning we're not going to be able to charge the same price as other people are going to be able to charge. But that's okay, because we're going to have hefty margins because our costs are going to come down more than our price is going to come down, right? In other words, right? So a classic example, this would be Walmart, right? Walmart is not selling at the kind of prices that Nordstrom is charging, right? But their costs are significantly lower, right? They're highly efficient in all aspects of their operation. It's not just that they sell perhaps a lower quality product than Nordstrom, right? It's that they have a really lean supply chain. They have an incredibly efficient store operations infrastructure. They have invested heavily in their technology, like all these things to create a lean, mean fighting machine, like a very efficient operation. They're selling general administrative costs very low, right? And so that's their basis of competition. And you would never want to get in a price war with Walmart, because if you did, right, they're going to be able to drop prices a lot faster than you and still be profitable, whereas you're going to hit that unprofitable line a lot quicker. And that's really ultimately, the competitive edge that they have. It's being able to understand it's all aspects of the operation, right? It's not just that, they can go get paper towels for 5 cents cheaper than you can. That's not an enduring advantage. But if they can, build in a cost advantage throughout the value chain, that's how you build an enduring low cost advantage.
When they're a broad, low cost entity where, they are looking at a wide array of products, they're competing in many different geographies. You also contrast it with the focused low cost differentiator. And you mentioned that as an example in a past lecture of Ryan Airlines, right?
It's based in Ireland. It's a exclusively European low cost budget airline. I like to say it's Southwest without the smile. It's a very frugal, very bare bones experience, but highly affordable. I mean, my kids, when they studied abroad, they fly it all the time because it's cheap. It gets them there. They do a whole lot of things to create a very efficient operation. For example, every plane is the 737 Boeing plane. So they have one set of training, one set of spare parts, right? One set of maintenance processes. They can easily swap planes. They don't use jet bridges, right? They make you walk on the tarmac to get on the plane. I mean, they have found every possible way to wring cost out of the system. And as a result, they're not offering a super pleasant flying experience, but they're getting you there generally on time at a very low price. And of course, they know who their customer is, right? Just as Walmart knows who their customer is. I mean, the customer who goes to Nordstrom to buy $1,000 men's suit is not going to Walmart, for that. And the customer who wants the luxurious British Airways first class experience from London to Singapore, well, that's not the Ryanair customer, right? And so a low cost player has to not only understand how to become more efficient, they have to understand who's the customer that is sort of willing to sacrifice some attributes of the product in return for a lower price.
Right. So we focused on the broad low cost provider of Walmart. We focus on the focused low cost provider of Ryan Airlines. Let's turn to the other competitive strategy. Really, that's the differentiation strategy. And once again, we can segment that market with a broad differentiator and a focused differentiator. Just give us some insight maybe on, what Starbucks does versus maybe Ducati does in this kind of competitive strategic approach.
Sure. So, a differentiator is one who their goal is to drive what we call willingness to pay, right? They're trying to charge a premium price. So they're going to accept the fact that their costs are higher than a lot of their competitors. But they're hoping to do is through some of that spending on things like research and development or branding or product quality, they're trying to drive the consumer's perception of value so high that they can charge a super premium price, right? So this is, investing in, higher quality grapes and, longer aging so you can create a wine that sells for $20 a bottle, not $5 a bottle, right? And so Starbucks, of course, is investing not just in higher quality coffee beans, but in the entire experience, the branding and the look and feel of the cafe, right? There's a whole series of elements they're investing in to try to cause you to pay $5 for that latte. And so that's differentiation is not just about the product, right? It is about image, it's about branding, it's about the experience in a location, all of these things, status. Why do we pay so much for a Tesla? It's not just because we're trying to save the planet. It's a status symbol. It's virtue signaling. It's all these other things, right? And so that's the Starbucks strategy. And it's broad, meaning there's a Starbucks in virtually every town, right? They're everywhere. Whereas a company like Ducati, we call them a niche player or more targeted or focused player. They're also a differentiator. They're charging a premium price for their motorcycles, Italian motorcycle brand. But they have much more focus, meaning it's a much narrower target market that they're going after and a much narrower set of distribution opportunities and channels and touch points than somebody like Starbucks. So the Ducati customer is quite distinct, for example, from the Harley Davidson customer in age and all kinds of demographic, but also in the type of ride they're looking for. A Ducati rider is not looking for comfort. They're looking for speed, right? I mean, this is about going fast, not about cruising, in a leisurely fashion through the beautiful scenery of Montana, on a long ride with your buddies. It's all about differentiation. So yes, the costs, so typically you're thinking about brands like Mercedes, BMW, Coach handbags. These are all differentiators, right? Their costs are higher, but they're able to charge a premium price.
That's right. And one thing that you do mention too, which I love, is that you state pick a strategy, identify that strategy, don't straddle, but you can really tell a company's strategy by looking at its financials in many cases. And you don't have to be a finance person, but for example, Walmart has much lower gross margins than a Target, lower overhead costs, lower selling, general, and administrative expenses, and it has a higher asset turnover. So you start to notice financial patterns associated with each one of these strategies, which will give you an indication of kind of what strategy they're pursuing, correct?
I like to say that you can see the imprint of a strategy in their financial statements. And so you can, with a pretty quick examination, you can begin to see the differences between a low cost player and a differentiator. You also see the firm that hasn't really got a clear strategy, what we would call a stuck in the middle strategy. You see a firm that, wait, their gross margins are not as high as Nordstrom, but their inventory turns are not as good as Walmart. So they're kind of just straying in the middle, right? They're not turning their inventory fast. They're not charging premium prices. What are they doing? What kind of retailer are they? Whereas with Walmart, it's pretty clear. They're thinner gross margins, but they're stacking them high and letting them fly, right? And they're selling a lot of product and they're turning that inventory and they're utilizing that infrastructure very efficiently. So yeah, we see the imprint.
Now, one thing I've noticed with Walmart, and this is kind of speaks more to strategies that we think of competitive advantage, or a lot of companies think, well, I want to take Walmart's supply and logistics piece and move it into my company, and I'm going to experience the same gains. What a lot of companies and individuals fail to realize that its competitive advantage is really an integrated, self-reinforcing system of capabilities, resources, and choices. And many of your prior choices make you more firm or stuck in your prior commitments and not able to change the system enough to see those same gains that you're hoping to experience by integrating a piece of someone else's system into yours.
We use the word best practices all the time, Charles, but I think it's a bit of a misnomer, right? It's really about tailoring your processes and capabilities to the market you're trying to serve. If we think about, the processes and the practices at Starbucks, they ought to be quite distinct from the processes at Dunkin' Donuts. It's not about better and worse. It's about they should be different, right? Because it's a different market. It's a different concept they're trying to execute. And so I think thinking about that and getting away from this idea that there's one best way, but instead thinking it's really about tailoring or aligning your processes and activities with the choices you're making and the target market that you have. That's what a great strategy is about. It's about alignment or fit. As you say, it's about an integrated system, not about one core capability that we have that we consider best in the world, but about a system that's well aligned and integrated to serve the market we're trying to serve with the value proposition that we are delivering for that customer.
And with Walmart, I mean, everything reinforces what they're trying to go after as that low cost provider. The value chain every day, low price strategy with little advertising, focusing on rural areas, a dense network of stores built around distribution centers. If Kmart tried to emulate the logistics of Walmart, it couldn't because it's how the logistics fit with everything else. So I think that's an important point for people to understand that you can see it, you can identify, but it's much harder to implement within your own structure. And like you said, it's a process and you want to be different. You don't want to mimic or try to copy others unless you're going to build it from the ground up that way.
Well, and one of the things that, we forget is that what people do is they try to copy parts of other companies and they don't realize that it's the whole, it's how it all fits together that really creates the wonderful advantage. So, you can happen upon and see a company and you see something they're doing and you think, oh, that's the magic. That's not the magic just alone, right? So you can, it's really how it all fits together that creates such powerful advantage. And so I think we miss that. By the way, the other thing with benchmarking is that we too often just end up imitating as opposed to benchmarking to learn and innovate, right? And so imitation often actually doesn't get us where we need to go.
Now let's move into sustaining competitive advantage. And what you mentioned too, that the ability of a successful company to be more profitable than its rivals is not about just achieving it. It's more importantly about sustaining it. And that's become more and more difficult this day and age. You identify three major external threats and then a couple things internally that are threats as well. So perhaps we could go through the external ones first, just to give our listeners some insight into what those categories are.
One way you lose your advantage, we just talked about it, is somebody does figure out how to imitate you and does it better, right? They do what you do, but do it better. The second one is a much more serious threat, what we call substitution, or sometimes people talk about disruption, right? This is not Hollywood video doing it better than Blockbuster. This is Netflix with an alternative business model that disrupts Blockbuster. And that substitute threat or that disruption threat is often comes out of left field, right? It's not your direct rival that you're keeping an eye on every day. It's this different player with a different model. And then holdup is not about losing out your advantage to the competition. It's about losing margin to other people in your supply chain, whether it be your customer or your supplier, exerting more power or leverage over you. So this is, Intel being able to extract a lot more value and the PC manufacturers losing out in that battle, right? And so as the PC industry evolved, it's not so much that one player lost share to another that really was the problem. The problem was that Intel and Microsoft captured all the value. And that's what we mean by hold up, right? That they were able to sort of hold up the PC manufacturers because they had exclusive products, patented, branded products that were the key to the machine. And they were able to capture most of the value.
Maybe we can just do a quick example of how Apple has really mitigated those effects. Since you mentioned the PC market, Apple developed its own operating system rather, so that it didn't have to depend on Windows and Microsoft, right? It's even developing its own chips. So the hardware element is going to come in-house or has come in-house with Apple. So that's mitigating supplier power along with the big box stores. It doesn't need to distribute through those channels because it has its own stores. What are some of the other ways that Apple's kind of differentiated itself?
Beautifully said, right? Their own operating system, their own stores. Things were not cheap, right? Those were expensive things. The other pieces, they disrupted themselves, right? They had this amazing thing called the iPod. They killed the iPod with the iPhone, right? Now, in retrospect, this looks like, well, obvious, but it's only because we know today that the iPhone won, right? At the time when BlackBerry was king and Apple was not in the phone market, the idea of coming to market with a phone that would also become your music player. If someone else did it better than Apple, they would have killed the iPod. And boy, that would have been, iPod at that point was the most successful product in Apple's history. So Apple's ability to be sort of forward thinking on that, Netflix's ability to be forward thinking and say, we're going to move to streaming because we know DVDs eventually will go away, right? And sort of killing their own DVD business. This is rare. Companies often don't want to cannibalize their existing business, and it causes them to be hesitant about innovating. But if you're going to have a long-term competitive advantage, you sometimes have to be willing to disrupt yourself.
Well, and one of the fascinating things too with Apple is turning a old strategy, kind of flipping it, the razor and blade strategy, and moving it into a blade and razor strategy when they were saying prior to Apple's iPhone, people weren't willing to pay a whole lot for their phone. And now you're getting people to pay hundreds or, thousands of dollars for their phone. And it's a brilliant strategy on their part, a risky one initially, I would say, but they've pulled it off, been very successful with it. Perhaps you can kind of go through that razor and blade strategy and what Apple did really to flip that approach.
Yeah, the term comes from Gillette, from the idea that, they sell the razor at a very low margin or maybe even below cost, but you're buying the blades forever, right? And that's where they make all this money. And so people often talked about razor and blades kind of models where you had these complementary products you sold. And David Yoffie was a colleague of mine at Harvard who used to say, "What Apple really with the iPhone, pioneered a blades and razor strategy, meaning rather than selling the razor at no margin and then making money off the blades, what they did is they gave out a lot of really inexpensive, cool, fun blades called apps and 99-cent songs and all these things. And they got us to pay $1,000 for a phone, right? I mean, something we never did. Remember, we paid almost nothing for phones before the iPhone came along. This is also this idea of the ecosystem, right? What Apple really understood was that it isn't just about the phone standalone. It's about and they learned this the hard way because they didn't get the ecosystem right back in the 80s. And that's why IBM and the IBM compatibles captured 90% of the market and the Apple computers stumbled. It's because Apple was very insular. They had an ecosystem, but it was an insular ecosystem, right? And so they changed, and they learned from that mistake in the 2000s. And they said, okay, we're going to allow other people to make apps that go on our phone, right? We're not going to only be in our own little ecosystem, right? And we're going to allow other people to make devices that are compatible with our phones and computers. And recognize that this is what we call the power of complements, right? It's one thing that was missing from the original Porter model, by the way, thinking about complements. And thinking about complements turns out in this world of hardware and software in particular to be really important.
Let's move into an example and kind of unpack this example because I love this example. I know you've written a lot about it. You've done a case study for Harvard regarding it on Trader Joe's because it's an example of a company in a very competitive industry. If you looked at it from the five forces model, this industry is not attractive at all.
I love when I'm teaching about strategy to find companies in pretty ugly industries that have found a way to build an advantage and be profitable. Because if we study a successful pharmaceutical company, well, how much are we learning about strategy? No offense to the CEOs of pharmaceutical companies or the scientists who do amazing work, but everybody makes money in pharmaceuticals. Lots of they'll make money in pharmaceuticals. But go into the grocery business, go into the fitness center business, go into the airline business and find people who've consistently made money. First of all, that's rare, right? And we might learn something really valuable about strategy. So I went into grocery and I went, this is the classic low margin business, right? Selling groceries. And yet here's Trader Joe's. What is this company doing? And what we learned from Trader Joe's is it's another Porter concept, right? That's really illustrated. It's the power of trade-offs. Actually, in a great book called Playing to Win by the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, A.G. Lafley, and Roger Martin, who's a former University of Toronto dean. They wrote this book called Playing to Win about 10 years ago. And they said a strategy is about choosing what to do and what not to do, right? And it reinforced the old adage of the old idea of trade-offs that Porter introduced. If you think about Trader Joe's, you can make a giant list of the things they don't do that a conventional supermarket does. They don't sell many branded goods. They don't have big parking lots and wide aisles. They don't have self-checkout. They don't do a lot of social media. They don't have anything on sale ever. They don't do coupons. They don't have a loyalty card. What kind of grocery store is this? No loyalty card, crowded parking lots, Oh, they have a limited selection. They only have like 3 or 4,000 items in the store. Most have 40,000. Who wants to go to this store? Well, the answer is, I mean, they have rejected a lot of the aspects of the conventional wisdom. But what they have done is create an amazing user experience that's very unique. They've created this treasure hunt in the store that people love, this curated selection of quirky items. And it's going there as a process of discovery. Right? It's this treasure hunt that customers love. But the key is that by making all those trade-offs, it's very difficult for the conventional supermarkets to imitate them. Because if, as an example, if here in the Northeast, we have one of the big conventional chains is Stop and Shop. They're owned by a European holding company. And there are conventional supermarkets. So they've got these massive stores, huge footprint, huge parking lots, massive numbers of self-checkout lanes. They've got a loyalty card program. They have 40,000 items or SKUs in their store. If they look and go, oh, Trader Joe's is making more money than us, but how can they imitate Trader Joe's? They can't undo all these commitments they've made. We like to say that companies, when they build a strategy, they make commitments, physical, financial, human commitments that are rigid. A good strategy takes advantage of the rigidities of your competitors, and making trade-offs, sharp ones, can often take advantage of those rigidities. So Trader Joe's is an example where it's hard for others to imitate because they've rejected a lot of the traditional notions of what grocery should mean and built what I might call the anti-grocery store, if you will.
You're right. And they do so many things that you would think would fly in the face of conventional wisdom. And they've built a very significant, profitable brand that has a cult like following that's kind of the antithesis of a grocery store chain, much like Planet Fitness is the antithesis of a gym, right?
Gyms are even worse than grocery stores, right? Because, I mean, think about how many gyms go bankrupt all the time, right? And the plethora of gyms, because you don't just have the change of all these mom and pops and everything. We could go through the five forces. The gym business is terrible. Customers are fickle. The barriers to entry are virtually non-existent. Price rivalry is massive. It's brutal, right? But you look and Planet Fitness has been pretty successful, right? I mean, they're not, profitable the way that Pfizer is in pharmaceuticals or Coca-Cola is in beverages. But as a gym goes, they've been able to be pretty consistent profitable. What have they done? No heavy weights, no trainers, no exercise classes, no smoothie bar, right? I mean, they've rejected all these aspects. Fitness enthusiasts mock the company. They say it's not really a gym. If you go online, this company gets torched by people who are really into fitness. But Planet Fitness doesn't care. They revel in the fact that they serve pizza once a month, right? Because they've oriented their strategy not toward the 20% of the market that's really into health and fitness, but the 80% of the market that's sort of the casual fitness person who either never belonged to a gym before or belonged and never went and sat on their couch, right? Their CEO said, our rival isn't really Gold's Gym or LA Fitness. It's Chili's and the movie theater. It's like, how do we get that person, right? And they create this judgment-free zone. So they make all these trade-offs. Think about now if you're Gold's Gym or you're LA Fitness, it's hard to copy them, right? Because you can't suddenly get rid of your free weights and get rid of your trainers and your exercise classes because your core customer is going to be ticked off at you if you did that, right? Mark Grundall, the co-founder of Planet Fitness, said to me, Charles, it's like, the mindset in many ways of the other gyms, right, is to serve people like them, right? Other fitness enthusiasts. And instead of saying, wait, but what's really going on? What do the customers really want? There's a lot of people out there who want to be fit, but they just would like a little cardio. They just want a little, burn a few calories, and they want to do it in an atmosphere that's more comfortable. And Planet built a gym for them and has done really successful. They'll never capture the customer who, is running marathons or doing weightlifting competitions or, who has 4% body fat. Frankly, they don't want that customer. That customer is expensive to serve, right? They want the customer who wants to get on the treadmill 3 days a week and who wants to do some light dumbbell work and look good going to the beach, and feel better about themselves, or maybe lose 5 pounds, and that's who they serve.
Well, that mindset's made all the difference as well. I mean, turning them into the anomaly in that industry that's not an attractive industry. They've done extremely well for that reason. I want you to kind of talk about one other industry, and that's the cruise line industry, and what Viking is doing that's different in that industry that's really differentiating its brand.
Yeah, so cruises is not as unattractive. Cruise companies do make money. Obviously, the pandemic, different, but generally they do make money. What's interesting, I'm just finishing up a case there about Viking, which is a company based in Norway, founded 25 years ago by Tor Hagen. And of course, as we know, you may know, seen a lot of their advertisements, they really pioneered river cruising in Europe, right? They took river cruising, which was this sort of pretty unattractive experience, pretty rudimentary experience, and they built a luxury river cruising business, right? Premium priced. But what Hagen and his team at Viking did is really interesting. If you go on their website, actually, or if you get their brochures, he actually has a page that says what Viking is not. We don't try to be all things to all people. I'm like, this is exactly what we teach. He's actually telegraphing the trade-offs, right? He's saying we're not trying to do everything. And one of those is we won't let anyone under the age of 18 on our ships. Remember what Royal Caribbean is doing, right? What Norwegian Cruise Lines is doing, what Carnival is doing, right? They're often serving families, and they've got the giant water slides and the extravagant. And what he's saying is, no, actually, it's all about the destination. It's about taking you places and letting you explore. And so he stripped away a lot of the amenities on the ship that are around families. One of my favorite quotes from him is, why do we don't allow anyone under the age of 18? Because we are serving the mature audience, meaning older couples, right? Who are interested in history and geography and culture. And, look, most people maybe enjoy their own grandchildren, but they don't like other people's grandchildren, is what he says, right? I mean, they don't want kids running around interfering with their experience, but also means he could strip away a lot of the things like casinos and giant water slides on these other ships and make a ship that's got this minimalist Scandinavian elegant design with a more extensive library on the ship, for example, right? He calls it the thinking person's cruise, not the drinking person's cruise. It's brilliance, right? And he set himself apart as a result, built different kind of ships, serving different kind of customers, taking them different places. And he became the dominant player in river cruising. Now he's trying to expand in the other segments, but been very successful as a result of that, but really understands his audience, right? The mature couple, 50 and older. I was really mad when I got my first Viking brochure, Charles. This is how I started doing research on the company. And, my wife, who's 4 years younger than me, she goes, well, I haven't gotten a brochure yet. Oh, thanks a lot. I really appreciate that, honey. That's great.
That's a great story. So before we end, two questions to ponder, to ask yourself: what can you do that others are not doing or are doing? What can you eliminate? What can you reduce to differentiate your brand? And then the second question is, what can we create or enhance that others are not doing or not doing enough of? So are there some additional questions you want to add to that, Mike, just to give our listeners some insight as they're starting on this journey, this process, or they're in the strategy process and they're trying to further differentiate their company, their brand, or possibly themselves?
Those questions are, of course, from the great book, Blue Ocean Strategy, where they talk about those questions, right? I think the other key question, when I think about a strategy, I think a great place to start is look at the current customer experience in the industry and ask, where are the pain points, and where are the unmet needs that we could eventually fill that void? Back to the Viking example, what's the pain point for that mature couple who wants to learn more about the world? Well, part of the pain point is a bunch of screaming kids running around and a bunch of drunks running around. Think about the things that make that cruise experience less pleasant, and let's find a way to give them a better experience, right? In a way.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this discussion that we had today. Remind everyone how they can get in contact with you if they want to reach out.
Sure, Charles. I mean, obviously, I hope they come to some of the IMS events that I'm a part of, and I appreciate being a part of. But they also can find me on the web at professormichaelroberto.com, or find me on LinkedIn and other social media platforms as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Dr. Roberto, for a great discussion today.
Thanks, Charles.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.